Hello, this is Scott Williams. Welcome to Fact, Faith, and Feeling. We try to figure out what's part of fact, what requires faith, and what requires feeling. Well, this is going to be a very different video today. This is the cumulative case for a creator, as I've learned it so far. So first of all, this is the claim. There's two options for how the world was made and developed. Evolutionists say the world made and developed itself. Creationists say someone made and developed the world. So this is another viewer response. Yeah, you get to state there is evidence for creationism, even though you haven't presented any. That is on topic if you raised it, but off topic if you can't show what you claim is true or answer a question about it. What a fraud. So I thank you for this response. Very on target. And I'll try to answer that in this video. So the question, what is the evidence for creationism? Well, I found this to be a very misleading question. Both sides have the same evidence. Well, how do you interpret the evidence? Well, I found that this is based on your presuppositions. You know, facts are neutral. We have the same sciences. The same biology, the same chemistry, the same geology. We have the same earth, same ocean. We all have the same facts. But all of these facts are interpreted. So there's not facts for evolution and facts for creation. It's all the same facts. Do the facts back up evolution? Or do the facts back up creation? So what are the presuppositions? Well, for evolution, origins and DNA are assumed. What about for creation? Again, origins and DNA are assumed. They're taken on faith, not based on the facts. Another presupposition of evolution is the idea of naturalism. For creation, it's something above the natural, beyond the natural. So for evolution, nature did it. But for creationism, God did it. But he did it with natural laws. He set up the natural laws that govern how things run. Another pillar of evolution is science trumps all. But for creationism, you have science and scripture working together. For evolution, macroevolution and microevolution are working together. For creationism, there's microevolution only, within their kind. Well, how did we get these positions? Well, for evolution, the base is the world made and developed itself. For creation, the base is someone made and developed the world, and this is revealed in nature. So for evolution, you study the world. But for creationists, you study the world, but you also study the scriptures. The two should fit together. So evolution would come up with a scientific hypothesis based on these observations. Take the best of what we found, come up with the best idea from this information. From the creationism side, well, it's a philosophical hypothesis, but it's based on observation. Observation from science, observation from the scriptures. Well, what does the scientific evidence support? We could say that the case for creation provides a plausible but not conclusive explanation for many things. But the case for evolution provides a plausible but not conclusive explanation for these same things. Plausible but not conclusive. Well, these are some of the things we're trying to explain. Information, complexity, micro and macro evolution, irreducible complexity, origins, symbiotic relationships, beauty, the origin of the universe, the origin of life, fine-tuning, consciousness, the capacity for reason, the first cell, DNA, the Big Bang. So we're trying to figure out what model would best explain these concepts. So which is the better case? The scientific hypothesis that we are using now, the evolutionary theory, or the philosophical hypothesis from the Bible science studies? Which one fits better with the evidence that we have? Well, to look at this in more in-depth, the claim is there's two options for how the world was made and developed. The world made itself, or someone made and developed the world. Another viewer response: you're evading the very debate discussion you claim to want. I believe this is because you have already ceded your intellect to religion and have no real interest in honest discussion around science or religion. Why do I say this? Well, take a look at your response to me. You reiterate in your reply that the question of accepting evolution is a matter for each church to decide. You see it as a question of theology. So, in trying to answer his question, I'm really listening, and I'm really trying to not evade this debate. I'm also trying to not disappear into my Christianity or try to run away from science. This question had to deal with, do you have to be an atheist to believe in evolution? That was the question we were trying to answer. So that is a matter for church theologians to decide. Is evolution innately atheistic? So individual church members, theologians, church leaders need to decide this. This is very different than the question, is evolution true? So yes, I do want to be a part of the debate. I do want to be a part of the discussion. Is evolution true? Is creationism true? Is there evidence for evolution? Is there evidence for creationism? So thank you for this response, and hopefully I've answered it. So the question, what is the evidence for creationism? Again, we found this to be misleading. Both sides have the same evidence. Answers in Genesis. I've used this many times. One of the things they recognize is that creationists and evolutionists all have the same facts. Therefore, what we are really talking about are different interpretations of these same facts. Both creation and evolution are belief systems that result in different scientific models and totally different interpretations of the evidence. So, creation and evolution are equally scientific and religious. The controversy is not religion versus science, but the science of one religion versus the science of another religion. So this goes into the presuppositions of creationism. Does it fit with evolutionary theory? Well, we've learned that this is all based on your presuppositions, the facts themselves being neutral. So what are these presuppositions? Well, we learned that for evolution, origins in DNA are assumed. Nature did it, science trumps all, and clearly macroevolution working with microevolution. Macroevolution is just a lot of microevolution. From the creationism side, origins in DNA are assumed, just like in evolution. But it's something above the natural, beyond it. God did it, but there's natural laws that apply also. Science and scripture working together, microevolution only. Well, what about this viewer response? They most certainly do not. Creationists are not able to objectively evaluate the evidence presented, and in most cases do not understand what they are looking at when it is. Creationists close their eyes and ears and do not care what the evidence shows. Instead, they twist, misrepresent, and lie about the evidence in order to continue believing in nonsense. So I think this response, more than any that I've read, shows the presuppositionalist approach. So for this writer, and again, I don't blame this writer at all, creationists are not able to objectively evaluate the evidence. I think this is coming from their presuppositions. And the same thing with creationists. Sometimes their presuppositions get in the way of even seeing if evolution could possibly be true. Well, here's my response. I think you just proved the point. They both have the same evidence. It is the interpretation of the evidence that makes the difference. I have seen misinterpretations on both sides of this issue. So this is what I was trying to point out. It's the same evidence, the same homology, the same bones, the same fossils, but it's our interpretation. So let's see what they responded to that. It is not the same evidence when one side, all in quotation marks, doesn't have any. Evidence is a set of demonstrable facts that only support one position over any other. You can't have the same evidence and come to a different conclusion about the evidence veracity. I think they mean veracity with an E. Voracity means like a voracious appetite, but that's okay. I get things wrong myself. So, what does it mean to have evidence? Evidence mean a thing or things helpful in forming a conclusion or judgment. So this idea of evidence. So the same fact, the same thing we've dug up, could end up being evidence for both sides, or they could use it as evidence in both sides. So this saying, you can't have the same evidence and come to different conclusion about the evidence veracity. So again, I think this is a misunderstanding of what evidence is. Evidence is just a piece of evidence. It's a bone you dug up. Now, where did the bone come from? We'll talk about later that if you see the similar structures in similar animals, they have similar bone structure. Well, that's the evidence, but where did it come from? How did it get there? That's very different than the evidence. The evidence is you've dug up two bones. To say one clearly is evolution or one is clearly creation is not part of the evidence. The evidence is you dug up some bones. Where did they come from? This now goes to answers in Genesis. Is it operation science or is it origins science? Bones would clearly fall under origins science. You weren't there. You need to use your presuppositions to figure out, where did these bones come from? My response: if you look into the matter, creationist evidence is all around us. The facts and evidence can lead to two different conclusions depending on worldview. If you see homologous structures, evolutionists see common ancestry, and creationists see the hand of a designer. Neither can be proven directly. And so the evidence points in two different directions. So homologous structure, that's the evidence. That's the fact. The question then becomes, where does it come from? The viewer responded, creationist evidence is all around us. Specifically, what evidence? Leads to two different conclusions. Please reread my sentence. I am talking about the veracity of the evidence. Okay, so again, the veracity of the evidence, so that would say, this fossil is a fraud. You didn't really find it here. That's not the same as saying, where did this bone come from? How did it get here? That's a very different question. So creationist evidence is all around us. Specifically what? So creationists are saying information. Information is best comes from an intelligent mind. You can't just evolve information. Complexity. We'll get into this later in this video, but it's just not reasonable. It's incredibly complex and interconnected. It's not reasonable. Micro and macro. Creationists are making the case is that micro is the only thing that's observed. You don't observe macro evolution. And it goes on, irreducibly complex, which I think hasn't been defeated at all. And again, if it was defeated, if that's a dead idea, well, this ministry would say, good job, evolution. You've made the idea dead. But that's the farthest from the truth. Things like symbiotic relationship, things that need each other, very hard to evolve those kind of things. Beauty, origins, the capacity for reason, the origin of life. How did life come from non-life? DNA, how did something come from nothing? The Big Bang. The Big Bang, how did something come from nothing? DNA. It's full of information. So not only the structure is incredibly complicated, but it's intertwined with information. So that's the evidence creationists are saying. I think I'm saying it, that it's not reasonable to think this all came from evolution. The viewer response. Creationists see the hand of a designer. They most certainly do not actually see anything. They assert, and this assertion has always been proven wrong. Well, this is something I do agree with. This is an assertion. This is part of your presuppositions. The creationists do see the hand of a designer. It's a presupposition. You cannot prove that. But what they are saying is evolutionists are saying the same thing. They're presupposing DNA and that whole machine, life, the Big Bang. All these things have no naturalistic explanation. They're just asserting it. So I absolutely agree. That's the point of this whole argument. All of these things are an assertion. They're a presupposition. Well, neither can be proven directly. Evolution is as proven as gravity, germs, atoms, electricity, and the same exact technology you are using right now. Evolution is a fact, a firmly established scientific theory, and the only theory that explains biodiversity. Well, of course, this comes from your presuppositions, that science trumps all. And again, this idea that evolution is a fact, that goes against all of science. Science isn't about proving things. It's saying this is what we know so far. This is the best theory we can come up with the information that we have. So, evolution being a fact, creationists are saying the only thing that's a fact is things that we can test, things that we can repeat. So, it's a fact in terms of micro, not macro. So the evidence points in two different directions. No again. Evidence is a set of facts that point to one position over any other. Creationists have no facts. They ignore the facts in favor of their preferred fables. Interesting to me, because I Took me a while to see this, but what do you mean they don't have any facts? They have the exact same facts as you do. They have the same sciences. They have the same fossils. Everything is the same. So to say they have no facts is just ludicrous. It's just not true. Of course they have the same facts. So I say this with deep respect for this viewer, but that's completely not true. Of course creationists have facts. They have the same facts that you do. They're putting those facts together and saying, it's more reasonable to assume a creator than this happened by evolution. Neither one of them can be proven directly. It's so considered to be plausible, but never conclusive. So there we have in this interchange, people talking directly by each other. For this writer, according to his presuppositions, creationism can never even be a starter. It never even can enter the realm of an explanation because it deals with a God beyond the natural world. And that, to this writer, is a non-starter. Creationists are saying, well, no. You can study the effects of the creation. You can study, is there evidence for a creator? So, talking by each other, no one's listening to each other. They're just talking purely from their presuppositions. And I hope if you get nothing else from this video, you get that these are presuppositions. These presuppositions cannot be proven directly. Well, one of the ideas that I keep hearing is you can't directly study the past. Answers in Genesis says this: since the physical world exists in the present, all the evidence a scientist has available to examine the physical world also exists in the present. The scientist has no method to examine directly the past. Thus, he must make assumptions in order to come to conclusions. So the physical world exists in the present, but you're trying to understand something from the past. You can't physically go back in time. You have to go with the clues that are left behind. However, these assumptions are unproven and generally unprovable beliefs. Assumptions are no more than untestable guesses. You can't go back in time and test these assumptions. They're assumptions. Stephen Meyer, he talked with Charles Thaxton, we saw this in another video, who thought that theories about the past can produce plausible but never decisive conclusions. Now, I'll refer to this several times in this video. Plausible but never decisive. If true, if these ideas are not testable, then why regard the claims of historical or origins theories as significant? Well, are these assumptions only echoed by creationists? No. Michael Ruse has said this. Ruse then stressed the pragmatic results of Darwinian theory, shore up the truth value of evolutionary science, in spite of its ultimate basis in philosophical assumptions. Nevertheless, Ruse repeated that evolution, akin to religion, involves making certain a priori or metaphysical assumptions which at some level cannot be proven empirically. And I think that the way to deal with creationism, but the way to deal with evolution also, is to not deny these facts, but to recognize them and to see where we can go as we move on from there. From Thomas Woodward, Doubts About Darwin. We also learned from another video this idea of discourse stories, sometimes called just so stories. And these are presented as evidence. And there was two kinds, factual empirical and semi-imaginative. The factual empirical kind This level embraces any kind of story or even a proposed plausible scenario that seeks to align itself carefully with the best available data. Of course, skillful art and purposive selectivity are always involved in such factual storytelling. The semi-imaginative kind, from the facts at hand, they project into the realm of imagination what is really happening now, what can be accomplished in the future, or what surely must have happened in the past. Such projection themes play a leading role in the formation of the rhetorical visions of both Darwinism and design, and also creationism. Michael Behe said this: "Some evolutionary biologists, like Richard Dawkins, have fertile imaginations. Giving a start, a point, they can almost always spin a story to get to any biological structure you wish." So, I found that in lieu of evidence, these stories are presented, and I found them to be a mixture of the rational world, facts, and narrative reasoning, story. So what are the presuppositions? We found that origins in DNA are assumed, but these are based on assumptions, and assumptions are unproven and generally unprovable beliefs. And this is true of evolution and creationism. Nature did it, or God did it using natural laws. Both at best plausible, but not conclusive. What about macroevolution and microevolution? Well, you can't directly study the past. So to look at something and say macroevolution happened is based on your assumptions. And it goes back to the same idea. Both at best are plausible, but not conclusive. What about the genetic evidence? Well, this is worth considering because the genetic evidence is in the present. We can study it. Does that make conclusive evidence for evolution? And in a future video, we'll go to this in more depth, but it's an interesting question. Does genetic evidence make conclusive evidence for evolution? What about science and scripture? Well, again, I found that these discourse, just so stories, they're given in lieu of evidence. So anything beyond microevolution, you have either this genetic evidence. In lieu of this, though, we hear these discourse stories. Well, what are the presuppositions? The first one for evolution was that origins in DNA are assumed. I think that Lee Strobel said it best, and that you have to believe that nothing produced everything, non-life produces life, randomness produces fine-tuning, chaos produces information, unconsciousness produces consciousness, and non-reason produces reason. It's a belief system. And the problem is that there's not a shred of evidence to support any of this. It is a belief about the past. You could go on to say that the development of the first cell, the first DNA molecule, etc., are all assumed. Now, they could have happened by evolutionary means. They could have happened by a creator. They are assumed on both sides. Here's a viewer response to my video. Evolution is not an origin story. Quote mining Darwin is a fallacy. So I would challenge that notion that evolution is not an origin story. You have to have a time where you delineate what's origin and what's able to be studied today. Now, quote mining Darwin, I try very hard not to quote mine. Most of my quotes are things that I've read directly. I've read the whole book or the whole article. Now, there are a few that slip by, either through lack of time or I didn't check it as carefully as I should. So I try to point those out, and I'll try to from now on, if I'm not absolutely sure about it. He goes on to say that evolution is not, it is a worldview, nor is it science, nor does it require knowledge of science. So there's your straw man fallacy, laid bare for the world to see. Don't do that again. I found this interesting, that atheism is a worldview. Let's ignore the bad grammar there. I do the same sometimes. But atheism is not a worldview. I would strongly challenge that. Of course, atheism, a world without God, would create a very different worldview than a theistic worldview. It very clearly is a worldview. It says, nor is it science, or does it require knowledge of science. So, what are you basing your atheism on? If you're not basing it on science and scientific evidence, what is it based on? Is it based on your personal preference? I don't like God, so I'm going to be an atheist? Is it a philosophical argument? I find that very strange. Atheism is not based on scientific evidence. Well, AronRa said that creationists insist evolution means the godless origin of life. He goes on to say that how life got here is not related to how it evolved, how it diversified, not how it began. Well, Answers in Genesis says this: evolutionists often claim that the theory of evolution has nothing to do with the origin of life. They argue that evolution only deals with issues of the changes in organisms over time. They contend that life has progressed through purely naturalistic means, without any supernatural intervention. However, if they argue that life progresses by purely naturalistic mechanisms, then they must also delineate a natural process by which life came into being. In other words, you cannot just assume a naturalistic origin when there is no evidence to support it. So this kind of blows out of the water the whole nature is all that there is, because there's no evidence to support that. Might be true, you could maybe build a case for that, but to say naturalism is all there is when there is no evidence wouldn't be good for science or for philosophy. What about the creationism side? They're saying the same thing. Origins in DNA are assumed. From Hebrews 11:3 says this: by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So this is by faith. And most creationists would challenge evolutionists on this point. You have no evidence for any kind of origin, so you're taking that by faith. And very clearly, creationists are doing the same thing here. By faith we understand. The universe was formed by God, and it's not using what we see around us. It's not made out of what was visible. Well, how do we prove either side? You can't go back and actually study it. The best we can do is look at the clues left behind. This is what Kenneth Miller said in Finding Darwin's God. He said, no one was there, so is it pure speculation? He said, well, no. Is Darwinism the same as any sort of story of origins? So in other words, is Darwin the same as creationism? And he says, well, a police detective was not there and can still solve crimes. The past leaves something behind. And again, this kind of logic works both ways. A designer would leave clues behind. Evolution would leave clues behind. But in a crime, proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. So you don't prove things absolutely, it's beyond reasonable doubt. And the same holds true for creationism. is it beyond reasonable doubt? Both are at best plausible, but not conclusive. What about evolution, naturalism? Nature did it. Well, as we said, in other words, you cannot just assume a naturalistic origin when there is no evidence to support it. So what about the evidence of naturalism after origin stories? Maybe you can't prove nature did it in terms of origins, but maybe once you get DNA going, you can have evidence in the present to prove evolution. Interesting theory. What about the creationism side? Above the natural, God did it. He used natural laws. Well, we had the statement, in other words, you cannot just assume a naturalistic origin when there is no evidence to support it. Can't you say the same about creationism? You cannot just assume a supernaturalistic origin when there is no evidence to support it. Can you just postulate God? Or as John Lennox words it, the complexity of God, a fatal objection? This is a viewer response to my channel. When creationists say design, it means something completely different. According to their narrative, designing things is a process by which fully formed plants and animals are literally spoken into existence with no precursor lineages, like that which we find in the fossil record. There is no reason to give this laughable opinion any merit, especially not in a scientific sense. So let's go through this a little bit, okay? As a process by which fully formed plants and animals are literally spoken into existence. Well, I know that it says that the universe came from God's spoken word. His spoken word is said to be quite powerful. That's just what the scriptures said, and is what creationists have to deal with. So is this true, though? Are fully formed plants and animals spoken into existence? Well, some forms of creationism would say, yes, this is exactly how it works. God spoke, and all these came into existence. Other forms of creationists allow for, the kinds to be created, and we got a lot of the diversity from the kinds. So the kinds were fully formed, but there was diversification after the kinds. Now it's interesting, there is no reason to give this laughable opinion. I think we can all agree what this is. This is just a rhetorical trick. Call it laughable, call it stupid, call it, creationists are just idiots. It's a trick to downplay the creationist side. Now, if you don't agree with the creationist side, that's okay. We need to come up with reasons why we don't agree. That's okay too. But this kind of in-your-face attacking creationists, or creationists on the other side, all evolutionists are going to hell. Neither one of those are needed in this debate. Let's respect each other, even an opinion we don't agree with. We are forced to deal with this idea, though. In Psalms 33, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. So it literally says that the heavens were made by the word of the Lord. Another viewer response. Again, asserting with no evidence that God did it does not qualify by any standard that can be applied to something that fits the definition of an explanation. So very good point. This is one I really appreciate. It's not attacking, but it's dealing with the material. So very interesting point, and I thank you. Well, can you just postulate God? This is from Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker. This is a long quote, but I don't want to be accused of, quote mining or taking bits and pieces from this. So I'm going to read this whole entire quote. So just bear with me. You can fast forward if you don't want to hear the whole quote, but I want you to hear it in its entirety, at least once in your life. So cumulative selection can manufacture complexity, while single-step solution cannot. But cumulative selection cannot work unless there is some minimal machinery of replication and replicator power. And the only machinery of replication that we know seems too complicated to have come into existence by means of anything less than many generations of cumulative selection. Some people see this as a fundamental flaw in the whole theory of the blind watchmaker. They see it as the ultimate proof that there must originally have been a designer, not a blind watchmaker, but a far-sighted, supernatural watchmaker. Maybe, it is argued, the Creator does not control the day-to-day succession of evolutionary events. Maybe He did not frame the tiger and the lamb. Maybe He did not make a tree. But He did set up the original machinery of replication and replicator power, the original machinery of DNA and protein that made cumulative selection and hence all of evolution possible. This is a transparently feeble argument. Indeed, it is obviously self-defeating. Organized complexity is the thing that we are having difficulty in explaining. Once we are allowed simply to postulate organized complexity, if only the organized complexity of the DNA protein replicating engine, it is relatively easy to invoke it as a generator of yet more organized complexity. That indeed is what most of this book is about. But of course, any God capable of intelligently designing something as complex as the DNA protein replicating machine must have been at least as complex and organized as that machine itself. Far more so if we suppose him additionally capable of such advanced functions as listening to prayers and forgiving sins. To explain the origin of the DNA protein machine by invoking a supernatural designer is to explain precisely nothing, for it leaves unexplained the origin of the designer. You have to say something like, God was always there. And if you allow yourself that kind of lazy way out, you might as well just say DNA was always there, or life was always there, and be done with it. This is from the chapter Origins and Miracles of the Blind Watchmaker. So to summarize, creationism cannot be a rival of Darwinism because it simply postulates an already existing being of prodigious intelligence and complexity without an explanation. We might as well just postulate the existence of life as we know it. Well, John Lennox has this. He said this makes God more complex and thus more improbable than the thing, organized complexity, that you're trying to explain. But he says this is highly illogical. We know that DNA was not always there, nor was life, or even the universe. And he says that to Dawkins, the only thing scientific is an explanation that moves from simple to complex. He said, for instance, the falling of an apple. It's really complex at the level of gravitation and curved space-time, etc. Atoms are simpler because we are made of them? No, atoms are very complex. We don't even really know what energy is. So why is God being complex bothersome to Dawkins? The other argument was, who made God? And this assumes a created God. This is wrong by definition. He is eternal. Another way of looking at this from Richard Dawkins, if the unexplained refutes the position, then you are left with the same questions from Lee Strobel. You have to believe that nothing produced everything, non-life produces life, randomness produces fine-tuning, chaos produces information, Unconsciousness produces consciousness, and non-reason produces reason. These do not explain anything, but set a limit where why questions stop. So if the unexplained refutes a position, you can't just postulate the beginnings. Richard Dawkins is saying that's what creationists are doing, just postulating a designer. But evolutionists are just postulating the idea themselves. They're doing the exact same thing. Well, remember, can you just postulate God? There was two options for how the world was made and developed. The world made and developed itself, or someone made and developed the world. So this isn't just a blind postulate. We're not just coming up with the idea out of nowhere. If someone made and developed the world, is that a studyable position in any way? Creationists would say you can study the effects of the creation. He would leave clues behind. It's simply exploring the other side. So this question, can you just postulate God? Well, if you can get over the first 5 words of the Bible, in the beginning, God created. So in the beginning shows that there's a definite beginning to the world, to the universe. God. This word means there's a being beyond the natural, above the natural, something beyond what science can test. Created. This shows intentional design. So there's a God who created intentionally. This goes against Richard Dawkins, who said there's only apparent design. So in the beginning, God created. It goes on to say he created the heavens and the earth and what he created, and in some ways, how he created. So if you can get over those first 5 words, you're on your way. Remember, this series is all about listening with respect. That's what this channel is all about. I'm listening to what everyone has to say. Will you listen with me? So this is a YouTube channel, so I would ask that you like this video if you liked it, and subscribe to this channel. By subscribing, it gives me excitement to continue, and it helps my numbers to grow. Let's listen together. Have a great day. See you next time. Bye-bye.